Okay, good evening, everybody. Again, let's try this again. We still have a few people trickling in, but it's 6:03, and we know that our distinguished speaker, Mr. Jim Powers, will have a lot of information that he wants to cover. So first off, thank you very much to Jim for being here tonight, and to Jenna and the entire staff of the Blackstone Library that has supported us so well for, I don't even know how long before I was a member of the Historical Society. So welcome to the board members here, the former board members. There's at least one former president of the Historical Society here. Welcome to the members, and especially welcome to the non-members, because during the registration process, we found out that there's a lot of interest in this, and a lot of you who are attending are not yet, and notice I stress the word yet, members of the Branford Historical Society. It's really a nominal cost. You can do it online. Most importantly, it supports programs like this. And more importantly, or just as importantly, because this is an important program, we have every third grade public school student in the town of Branford come in every single year. We're restarting that now that we're, as they say, post-COVID. And your membership helps support keeping the lights on and keeping the heat on, because we can't have the pipes freeze. So if you're not yet a member, please do sign up. It's very easy to do online and indicate the items in which you're interested in volunteering for. Sorry, I dangled the preposition there. And we look forward to your membership and your renewals year after year. If you're a member and you haven't yet renewed, shame on you, please go ahead and do so. As I was walking in the library tonight, and some of you may have come in the same way. Well, tell me, raise your hand. Did you come in through the downstairs entry by the circulation desk? Did any of you notice a quilt that's there as you walk in on the right-hand side? Did any of you know, this is really a quiz for you. Did any of you notice what's at the top center panel of that quilt right there? It's a scene from the beginning of Branford when it was called Totoket, and it's apparently English colonists and not Dutch ones. Jim knows a lot about the Dutch who were here first. Greeting the local indigenous people with everybody has outstretched arms and big smiles and everything. So some of the history of Totoket, later Branford, may have been like that. And some might have been very, very different. And Jim will talk about that tonight. One other thing to mention is that at Harrison House, our museum and headquarters, we've just received a very generous donation. I think one of our members, Joe Naylor, went and picked it up out of state. It's some beautiful stone points. So that would be arrowheads, spear points, other items. And Jim has taken a look at those. And Jane Pooley, Jane, if you can raise your hand, our town historian has seen those. Joe's working on getting those displayed. So we'll send out some sort of information notice through our publicity group when those are all ready to display. Jim's going to help us with the history, the provenance of those, but we're adding to our collection all the time and making new display cases. That also is what your membership will help fund. So without further ado, I'll introduce Sue Winkle, our programs chair, who will introduce Jim to us. Thank you all for coming tonight. Oh, one other thing. Thank you to those board members who brought refreshments. There'll be refreshments served at the back. And Alpha Coiro, one of our board members, organized that. Thank you, Alpha. Have a good night, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Winkle, as Matt said, and I'm very excited to welcome back Jim Powers today. He was with us last October to talk about the Dutch fort down at Indian Neck. Jim is a historian, author, and educator. He's a founding member and current board member of the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum at the Dudley Farm in Guilford. His latest book, Shadows Over Dawnland, is a historical novel that tells the story of the first 50 years of English Quinnipiac interactions through the eyes of a Quinnipiac shaman. Jim is generous in sharing his knowledge with others, including the Historical Society. I think Matt referenced, he was kind enough to come visit the Harrison House in November and took a look and went through all of our Native American artifacts. And thanks to his input and some of the contacts he provided us, you're going to be hearing a lot more about that in the coming year. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Powers.
Thank you, Sue. Matt, always a gracious introduction here. Then I always wonder if I can live up to the billing, but we'll see how that goes. Yes, you do have an incredible collection of Native American artifacts at the Harrison House. Just a quick look, you have things that go back to the Paleo Indian period, which I'll be talking about shortly, all the way up to the Woodland period, including a lot of pieces that are relatively unique. So I would look forward to you folks getting to see in the future what you really have here. And from what I understand, according to Jane's tale, these all came from Branford and not elsewhere. So that's really kind of a neat and unique collection. But anyway, it's really nice to be here in Totoket, one of the main villages of the Quinnipiac at the time when the Europeans arrived. At that point, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, there were actually only 4 villages left. By Europeans, I mean the English in 1638. There was Totoket here, there was Myunkatuk in what is now the Fairhaven, East Haven area. There was another village that the English never recorded the name, that was headed by a sachem by the name of Monowis. That was in North Haven, just above the New Haven line. There's still an area of North Haven today called Monowis. And then, of course, there was Monowis, which is near and dear to me because that's Guilford. But anyway, what I'm going to do today is tell you the story. It's sort of an overview of the history of the Quinnipiac, sort of give you an idea of how long people have actually lived in this area. And then I'm going to tell the story of what happened to the Quinnipiac once the Europeans arrived. First the Dutch, and then the English. And if I push the right button, we'll be good. Some of you may be familiar with this, this monument. Some of you may have never seen it before. This is actually in the Fairhaven section of New Haven. It's right in the middle of Fort Worcester City Park on Townsend Avenue. And it's really sort of an important monument for 2 reasons. First of all, that Fort Worcester Park is actually all that remains of the first Quinnipiac or first Native American reservation ever created in New England, Northeast, or what later became the United States in 1638. It was also the last piece of property that the Quinnipiac gave up in 1630. This monument was put up in 2003, I believe, and I have mixed feelings about it. It says a Quinnipiac Indian family walks to the harbor to meet the English newcomers, April 24th, 1638, as their way of life changes forever. And it has a happy-looking little family walking along. They even have their little dog, and you can see the English ship. Now, when it was created, I know it was created with really good intentions, but knowing what I now know about the Quinnipiac experience, it's a little too nice. But it's there, and it's important because it marks that spot. And on the bottom of the monument is the names of all the sachems and sagamores, are counselors of the sachems who signed the first, I don't like to call it treaty, agreement with the English in 1638. And on the far right side is one of my heroes, which I'll be talking a little bit more about. That's Shapashu. Now, Shapashu was a sachem, but she was also a female. And she was a sachem of Monowis and was a very important leader amongst the Quinnipiac. And later on, she became the most important leader for the Quinnipiac. And unfortunately for her, I can only imagine this because as time went on and the Quinnipiac had to make more arrangements with the English in terms of agreements and giving up land and things like that. She was pivotal in terms of signing these things. However, in all the documents, the English would not refer to her by name. They'd only refer to her as sunk squaw or the female sachem, something like that, but they never would mention her by name. And that gets to some of the cultural differences we'll be talking about in a minute. Now, I'd like to start these talks with this absolutely horrible to see timeline. But the important thing for me is the fact that this shows you how long Native American people were in this area. If you look to the far left, let's see, I think I have a zoom in here somewhere. Way over here is the year 15,000. Okay, that's when we know Native people began to come to what is now Connecticut. We know for sure the oldest existing site currently in Connecticut is dated to about 13,500 years ago. And it's up in Avon, Connecticut. It was found about 6 years ago. It's called the Brian Jones site. They're still actually working on it. And more and more evidence is coming out all the time. So when you think about people living here, 15,000 years, or just go back to 13,500 years, then you think about how long our society has been here. You really start to get a sense of how long people were here. Now, if we were here 26,000 years ago, or even 20,000 years ago, guess what we'd see? That's it, okay, the glacier. The Great Laurentide Glacier came down out of Canada and covered what is now Connecticut. We would have had sitting here, right, if we were here, say 20,000 years ago, a mile of high ice above us. The landscape of Connecticut was shaped by this glacier. So a lot of the, you may notice as you wander around in Connecticut, all of a sudden you'll see these big boulders hanging out in different places, and you think to yourself, how'd they ever get there? Well, that was because they were deposited by the glacier. This is a map that shows you the full extent, or the farthest extent of the glacier, which has the red lines. That area there is the farthest extent of the glacier. And if you have friends in Long Island, or you know people in Long Island, or you're from Long Island, you have to remember that you grew up, or they live on the riprap of the glacier, pushing soil, dirt, and everything down all the way from Canada. I always used to joke with my students that it's sort of like a big plow that sort of stopped at that point. About 17,000 years ago, you can see there's a line where you can see where the glacier began to retreat. Now, during this time period and going back to 26,000 years ago, the Atlantic Ocean was 60 miles to the south of what is currently the South Shore of Long Island. Unfortunately for archaeology and historians and anthropologists, there are probably thousands and thousands and thousands of early Native American sites that are currently now under the Atlantic Ocean. But then as you proceed up the map, you can see by 16,500 years ago, the ice was roughly here. And then as you go 16,000, it's here, 15,000 here. Now here's Branford right here. So you can see that it was by 16,500 years ago, this area was ice-free. But the problem was this, as that ice melted and continued to move northward, you see a situation where you had inland lakes formed. This is a gigantic lake that went from roughly where Middletown, Connecticut is today, and Rocky Hill, all the way up to the Canadian border. It was called Lake Hitchcock. And this forms the basis of what is today the Connecticut River. But more importantly, where Long Island Sound today was a freshwater lake for during the time once the ice had moved north. And by where Fisher's Island is an area called the Race, off along Connecticut shore in Rhode Island. There was a waterfall there that carried a greater volume of water and was taller than Niagara Falls. So it just must have been a really quite of an impressive thing to see. But as things began to warm up, you had Connecticut's environment turn into this, a tundra. And a tundra was certainly just seasonal. In the winter, it's covered with snow and ice. And then this is a shot of what a tundra looks like today up in Alaska. And what would happen during this time period? This is about 15,000 years ago, and then later, large extinct animals would begin to move up into this area. Bison, which are still not extinct, large herds of caribou, mammoths, mastodons, dire wolves, giant beavers, and even saber-toothed tigers. Actually, all came up into this area during this very brief summer, and then they migrated back south to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Virginia, and that area. And on the heels of these people, guess who? The Native Americans. And these people became known as the Paleo Indians. Now, I know you guys would have loved to have been able to see one of these guys walking around, right? But this is one of my favorite pictures because, you know, when you start to think about the fact that these creatures were just here in large numbers, it must have just been an amazing thing to see. Going back to that Paleo Indian site in Avon, Connecticut that I was telling you about earlier, they recently have done DNA analysis on a spear point, a Paleo native spear point, and they found elephantine DNA on it, which means that these early humans were certainly hunting these things. However, they've done studies and they realize now that, contrary to a lot of popular myths that once the Native Americans got here, they killed all the mammoths and the mastodons. Well, what happened is, as the climate changes and the vegetation changed, what happened was the mammoths and the mastodons could not digest the new plant food. So basically they all started to starve to death over time as the climate changed and warmed. I love this picture. How many of you would volunteer to do this? It's I don't think they did either, to tell you the truth. I mean, that guy in the front, you got to be kidding me, right? But it's pretty dramatic. We now know that they probably when they did hunt these giant creatures, they probably ran them into swamps where they would get stuck and they wouldn't be able to move very well, and then they could attack them. The other thing they would probably have done would be just to try to chase them and run them off of cliffs. And once they fell, then they could butcher them. But to confront one of these things would have been absolutely crazy. Now, about 9,000 years ago, okay, so this is 6,000 years later, we had a change to a different type of environment as the climate began to warm and the ice began to retreat farther and farther north into Canada. You had an environment called a boreal forest, which you still have in northern Canada, northern Alaska, and Siberia. As a matter of fact, there are more trees in the boreal forest today than anywhere else in the world, including the Amazon. Now, by 9,000 years ago, once again, here's my favorite horrible timeline. About 9,000 years ago, which is right about here, okay? By then, we know that people were living here permanently because the climate had changed enough so that they didn't have to move in and out seasonally anymore. And what happened was, as the climate changed and the environment changed and the animals changed, you had these people who are now permanently here developing different cultures. And this time period became known as the Archaic Period. And it lasted until about 3,000 years ago. So this is another 6,000 years of culture. And of course, artists like to depict their lifestyle because this is where archaeologically, there are a lot of remnants of archaic materials. As a matter of fact, at the Dawnland Museum at the Dudley Farm, they make up the largest part of our collection. And your collection at the Harrison House, from what I can see too, also is made up mostly of archaic projectile points and other items. They were living here seasonally, but they would move from the shoreline area and the estuaries of the rivers. They would be there in the spring and summer, and then they move inland into the inland areas to hunt during the fall and winter. And this depicts their one of their little villages. We also know that they moved around quite a bit on water, and that continued right up through the Woodland Period. But one of the big revolutionary items that came along during the Archaic Period, they're not really sure when it actually got to Connecticut here, but sometime around maybe 8,000 years ago, was this. It's called an addle-addle. It's a smaller spear with a throwing stick. And it gave them tremendous accuracy, tremendous velocity, and tremendous distance compared to just having a spear. Now, most people think that, oh no, Native Americans always had the bow and arrow. Well, the bow and arrow only was introduced about 2,000 years ago. Not, right around the junction between, the year 0 and whatever. And this is the depiction of that. But what happened is they had to change the type of weapons they used because the animals changed, and the animals changed because the plants changed, and the plants changed because the environment changed. And it went through various phases during their 6,000 years, from that boreal forest, which I showed you a picture of, to a time period when Connecticut was basically a dry grassland with hardly any trees at all, and wild extremes of cold and heat. And then eventually, by about 3,000 years ago, we had the evolution of the environment that we used to have in the 20th century, not necessarily what we have now. And this is just another wonderful little artist depiction of one of their villages. And I always laughed and wonder what that dog is thinking. And now watercraft were something that was really important to them, as I mentioned earlier. Unlike the idea that, oh yeah, they all made birch bark canoes and sailed up and down the river. So that's Northern Europe. I mean, Northern New England and Northern New York. The natives here actually made what are called dugout canoes, where they would actually cut down a tree and begin to burn the surface on the top. And as it burned, they would chop out the charcoal and eventually smooth it out and use that as a canoe. We have a wonderful reproduction that was given to Gordon Brainerd, who started our museum at the Dudley Farm. It was actually made by one of your Branford residents here, Peter DeRoss. And it's going to be one of our main items in our exhibits. And to think that this might have limited them getting around in terms of numbers of people or whatever. John Winthrop Jr., the first governor of Connecticut, when he was looking out along the Sound or in a boat or whatever, he recorded in his journal that he saw one dugout canoe with 30 men in it in Long Island Sound. And they crossed back and forth along Long Island Sound all the time. They went whaling on these things. I mean, it was really quite impressive to think about, first of all, the size of the trees that they must have been harvesting, but also the fact they would do what they did. And of course, by the time we get to the Archaic Period, we're getting into a situation where we're pretty sure about the gender roles for the different groups of people. In terms of women's work and men's work, I could go on and on about this sort of thing. But what it came right down to is, I hate to say it, guys, but women did most of the work. And then when we get to the Woodland Period, they're also the agriculturalists, and they do all the farming as well. Men fished and hunted, and if necessary, fought. Now, the last period that we sort of need to mention, and this is the period that's most important to us because this is the period that it takes place when the English and the Dutch arrive, and that's the Woodland Period. And that begins about 3,000 years ago right about here, and it's broken into different time periods. Here's the arrival of people in Connecticut, Europeans in Connecticut in 1633, and this is the year 1750. You know, if we extend this out all the way to us, that's fine, but you can get a sense of how limited the time period was that the Europeans have been in here compared to that of the Native American people. Now, this is a map, I hope we can see it, of the basic tribes of New England. And this is mostly based on the English and the French and the Dutch recording who and where these people are. Down in the bottom of Connecticut, along the shore, right in the center, you can see the Quinnipiac. And then to the north of them, the groups called the River Indians, got the Paugusets, the Mohegans, and the Pequot. This is a more detailed map of Connecticut at the time when the Europeans began to arrive. And this is an important map from our point of view because it shows the location of the Quinnipiac, located right in the center of the map, but it also is centered around New Haven. We know that the Quinnipiac's primary village, the village of the Grand Sachem, was at New Haven at the time when the English arrived. And they extended the area of control all the way up to where you can see, if you follow the Quinnipiac River there, you see a group called the Tunxus. They were their close relatives, and eventually they joined with them in the 1700s. But, and then they extended all the way down to where you see the Hammonassets on the far right, and then over to where the Paugusets are on the far left. That area was the area that was under the control of or use of the Quinnipiac when the English arrived in 1638. This is just a fun little diorama type of thing, but it kind of shows you, their village organization type of thing. I use this because students like it. We know a lot about their houses, called wetus or wigwams, because of, first of all, Native American people, but also because one of the presidents of Yale, Ezra Stiles, who I mentioned a lot about when we were talking about the Dutch fort, he diagrammed these things, he measured them, he talked all about what they were made of and things of that nature. So we know a lot about what these are. And it's kind of neat because that way now, when we have people doing reproductions, they're able to follow exactly what he had sort of described. And this is just a reproduction one at a gathering. What they would do is just simply take saplings and bend them over, and then they would tie them together with sinew or reeds or long flexible grasses. They would then cover these. It depended on the time of year. If we were here in Totoket in the spring and summer, you'd see what's on the left-hand side. They would cover them with different types of rush grasses and things of that nature, making mats out of them. And then in the winter, they would cut bark of primarily oak trees, but other types of trees too, and then have them covered with that. When they moved from, say, the shoreline inland for the winter, they would strip down the mats or the coverings, and they would just leave the frame, and then they would come back and then the following season and just recover. There's a great document from Old Lyme where some of the early English settlers were freezing one winter in their little colonial house, trying to almost fall inside their fireplace to stay warm. And an Indian, the Hantic Indian said, "Come live with us." They went and they spent the rest of the winter in the wetus in the Hantics, and they said they were an awful lot warmer and more comfortable. So they also had these large long houses. They could house anywhere from 3 to 5 families. This is a reproduction one on one of the Iroquois reservations. And that just kind of gives you a sense of what it looks like inside. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of all this now. This is a Dutch map, and it's one of the earliest maps that shows southern New England. And of course, it's turned in a different direction, so you have to kind of reacclimate. But I think you can all see you can see Cape Cod, and up on the top right, you can see there it is, Long Island, and way up here, they wrote a word called Quirpies. Now, the Dutch, when they first encountered the Quinnipiac, they called them the Quirpies because they asked the Quinnipiac who they were. And of course, they said Quirpies. And it turns out Quirpie is also the name for the dialect, Algonquian dialect that they spoke. And so on these early Dutch maps, you don't see Quinnipiac or anything like that. All you'd see is Quirpie. Of course, the Dutch claimed everything from Cape Cod down to the through New Jersey to the Delaware Bay. And this is another Dutch map that shows what they called New Netherland at the time. That little skinny pink thing off on the shore, that's what they said, okay, the English claim that, but we don't really believe it. And somehow they're depicting Long Island as English, and I'm not sure why. But this map actually, if I could blow it up, is really sort of interesting because this one actually is the map that identifies red dunes. For any of you who were here for the talk I did about the Dutch fort, which is here in Branford. And this is based on information that was the Dutch had by about 1620. And here's a later Dutch map. And this Dutch map also identifies, you can see right in the center towards the top, it says Quirpie. So it shows the land of the Quinnipiac. But also it's because it's about 1660, right before the English take over New Netherland, you can see they're identifying some of the towns. So for example, you see right here, Totoket. Okay, they call it Guilford. This is New Haven, or what the Dutch called Rodenburg. And then you see these other towns along the way here. This is Saybrook over here. So the neat thing about this is it's showing Totoket, not Branford, and it's also showing your favorite islands off the coast there. So the question is, why were the Dutch here? Well, it's really simple. They were here to trade. What they were interested in trading for were beaver pelts and otter pelts, because back in England, I mean, back in Europe in general, you know how men are always fashion plates, right? They have to really look good. Well, to look good as a man back in Europe in those days, you had to have a beaver hat. If you had a beaver hat, you made it. And so there was big money for the Dutch. They were also, as I said, during the talk about the Dutch fort here in Branford. They were also timbering, taking wood back to Europe because wood was incredibly scarce in Europe by this time. So they made contact with all the people along the shoreline of what is now Connecticut and Long Island very, very early on. We have records of some of these contacts as early as 1598. And this is just another little thing about the Dutch fort here in Branford. On the far right is an actual picture of the drawing that Ezra Stiles did and you can see it in his journal. And the other one on the right is one that Dr. John Pfeiffer and I put together when we first were doing the talks on the dig on Indian Neck. But on the far right side, where the neck is narrowest, you see a little X that Ezra Stiles noted, which means the Dutch fort. And here's another picture, which is off a redone version, a readable version of Ezra Stiles' itineraries, and you can see a better look of that here. The Dutch fort being right there. And one of the neat things about this is that he talks about the fact that it was the largest collection of shells between Cape Cod and New York, right above the neck. So it'd be that area right here. It's a gigantic shell midden. And the question becomes, why? Well, the question was, the reason why is because what the Dutch were really interested in finding were wampum beads, which there they are. They learned very early on that trading for what these beads, which the Native Americans made out of whelk and quahog shells, was really the thing that would attract other Native people to trade the furs that they were trapping. And so early on, they started to work out deals with all the different Native people. And I can't help but think that they had worked out with the Totoket early on because of that shell midden, the fact that they could make these wampum beads. Well, what's with the wampum beads? Well, the Native people would weave them into items like this, which they would wear and display. They were used sometimes woven into big belts, sometimes breastplates. But what they did is they actually explained where the person was from, what their lineage was, and what their status was, which was really important to Native people. So what they did, the Dutch, is they worked out a deal very early on with the Pequot to sort of dominate and control the production of wampum beads. And the Pequot then went and sort of dominated the rest of the Native people in Connecticut here. We'll talk more about that in a minute. This is also a copy of a Dutch map, and this one's a little different. There's a little circle you can see sort of on the top. The Dutch had a trading house where Hartford now is today. They built it in 1632 to try to capitalize on the beaver pelts coming down from the Connecticut River in northern New England. And it's where Hartford is today. It lasted until 1652, okay? Now, this is an important point because you all know from your history classes that the English Pilgrims settled Plymouth in 1620, right? So by 1632, they were getting into the trade for furs as well. And they decided they were going to one-up the Dutch by building a trading house where Windsor, Connecticut now is in 1633. And on this map, it's the, right here, Poquonock, right here. Well, what happened the winter of 1633-34 was smallpox broke out. Now, smallpox, well, first of all, the English blamed the Dutch blamed the English, of course, but it decimated all the Native groups that lived along the Connecticut River. The Poquonock people, for example, where Windsor is today, they lost 90% of their people just that winter from smallpox, but it spread quickly throughout all of Connecticut, and as a result, groups like the Quinnipiac were decimated. John Menta, who wrote an incredible history of the Quinnipiac, estimated that they lost about 80% of their people, because by the time this smallpox ended in 1634, it was a 2-year epidemic. All the Connecticut groups of Native Americans had lost tremendous amounts of people, anywhere from 50% to 90%. And, I keep telling people, look how we've had to struggle through going with COVID. Can you imagine in 2 years losing 80%, 90% of your people? It just must have been decimating. And it wasn't just, the children or the old, it was everybody. And this so weakened the Native American people in Connecticut that when the time came for the English to begin to spread their settlements, the Native people were pretty much powerless to stop them. And I'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. And on the bottom left, I don't want to leave you guys alone without talking about Totoket. There it is, once again in the Corby. So you can see you're sitting right there in the middle. This is a kind of a interesting depiction of a shaman trying to save somebody with suffering from smallpox. They were really great healers using traditional medicines. And it wasn't just mumbo jumbo, and it wasn't just, superstitious stuff. I mean, these guys they were good. They knew what they were doing, and they were powerless to stop this. They had nothing in their arsenal that could save people. Now, to make matters worse, just when this was happening, the English were beginning to spread their areas of settlement throughout New England. And by 1636, there were 4 established English colonies. There was Massachusetts Bay, you can see in green there. Plymouth, down by Cape Cod. You had Rhode Island, and then you had the Connecticut colony, which was that spread from Springfield down to what is now Saybrook. This created pressure on the native people who had survived smallpox, and it created a situation where they wanted to either trade with these people or have nothing at all to do with them. But what happened was the impact of the smallpox epidemic and the impact of competition that was breaking out between the Dutch and the English for trade purposes broke out into war with the Pequot. Now, the Pequot, in this particular case, I'll show you right here. They're based in this area right here, right? And they became the dominant during the 1620s and early 1630s. They dominated over all the other native people and controlled their trade with the Dutch and then later the English. They became the middlemen, and the people like the Quinnipiac became tributaries. They had to provide a certain number of furs. They had to provide a certain amount of wampum every year. Otherwise, they would have to answer to the Pequot. Well, there were a series of murders of Englishmen, one accidental, the other not so accidental, that sort of resulted in the English in Massachusetts Bay declaring war on the Pequot. And they attacked them in a group of Pequot allies on Block Island. And after attacking them, they then attacked the Pequot village and burned it. Then they said, okay, we're done. And they went home back to Massachusetts Bay. The Pequot were so incensed that they knew there was a small English garrison of 20 men at Saybrook Point that had just finished building a fort. And they went and they surrounded that fort and they besieged it for 7 months. Every time the English tried to leave, they attacked them. They only survived because of the leadership of their commander, Lyon Gardner. And eventually, the Pequot decided to attack Connecticut colony, and they attacked Wethersfield. They killed 9 people and kidnapped 2 girls, and they killed a bunch of livestock. That brought Connecticut into the war, and Connecticut then organized a small army together with the leader of the Mohegan by the name of Uncas and his men, and they surprise attacked the Pequot at Mystic. They surrounded it in the middle of the night and burned it. And as a result, it was a horrible massacre where about 400 to 800 Pequot died within the fort, because when they tried to get out, the English and the Mohegan allies blocked the entrances and would kill whoever tried to get out. And so it was a terrible massacre. The surviving Pequot from other places then attacked the Englishmen, and there was an incredible running battle from the Mystic, what is now Mystic, Connecticut, to the Connecticut River, where the Pequot constantly attacked this English army until they got on boats and were able to get away. The surviving Pequot then decided to do 2 things: either sort of to melt into the wilderness or join other groups, or flee. And the majority decided to flee to the Mohawk and the Dutch in New York. They were caught in what's now Fairfield, and after a 2-day battle, were forced to surrender. But not before they negotiated for their women and children to be allowed to leave where the battle site was. And the English said, "Oh, sure, no problem." And as soon as they left, the English captured them all, the women and children, and eventually sold them all slaves in Bermuda. But that was it for the Pequot War. Now, why talk about this for the Quinnipiac? Well, the Quinnipiac had been allies of tributaries of the Pequot. When this war broke out, they didn't want anything to do with it. So they decided they were going to be neutral. However, being neutral wasn't necessarily an option that they had. So the majority of them fled north to Hartford and Wethersfield and stayed and lived among the English up there while the war was going on. And this is an important point because when the English then decide to settle Quinnipiac land, this is an idea in the head of the Pequot leaders that it's not so bad living amongst the English. Okay, so that gets us to this. By 1638, a group of Englishmen had just arrived in 3 ships with 500 colonists in Massachusetts Bay. They found out that there was this wonderful harbor in southern Connecticut that would be an ideal place to set up a mercantile settlement. So they went and they landed, and you saw the depiction on the monument that I started off with. They came here and immediately outnumbered the Quinnipiac who were living in Quinnipiac Harbor. Their main village, once again, was called Mayunkatuk. Historians have done, and statisticians have done all this sort of work and have decided that maybe at most the Quinnipiac had about 460 people at that time. Now, they also estimate that the pre-smallpox epidemic population of the Quinnipiac was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 5,000. So you can see what happened to them in terms of disease. Now, the English were really interested right away in negotiating with the native people, the Quinnipiac. And the reason why they wanted to do that was this. They were actually squatters. They did not have permission to be where they were from the English government. So the next best thing they thought is if they could sign a treaty with the Quinnipiac, they could wave that up and down and say, we got title, see, they gave it to us. And so that was their main motivation. I'll just kind of skip this really quickly, but the English leaders were John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton, very savvy businessmen, and one was a minister. The leader was Mawagin of the Quinnipiac. He was their grand sachem. Now, he was the brother of Shapashu, and his uncle was the sachem here in Totoket, and I'm going to mess his name up. His name is Quesaquanch. Well, there he is. You can see him on the bottom of the last list there. What they did is they negotiated with the Quinnipiac negotiated what they thought they were creating a joint use of the land. Native people in New England and throughout North America, and especially in our case, Connecticut, had no concept, first of all, of private property, second of all, of private ownership of land. To them, it was impossible culturally to own land. You had only the right to use land, okay? And so in their tradition, when somebody new comes to your community and asks to stay, guess what you do? You say, sure, we'll share. That's the way their culture worked. And it worked that way in all sorts of things. And so as a result, when the Quinnipiac signed their agreement with the English, they firmly believed what they were doing is creating a document where they were agreeing to share the land, not sell the land. Now, the English, on the other hand, had a whole different way of looking at this. The idea for the English was very simple. They brought English legal ideas in terms of private property and private ownership with them. And so for them, I can show you some of the little parts of these different treaties, it's very important that they know what land they're buying and who they're buying this land from. Now, of course, when they're making these treaties, the English, who's translating the treaties to the Quinnipiac? The English are. Okay. And in this first one, the person at the very bottom of that list there, it says Thomas Stanton, be an interpreter. Thomas Stanton hated Native American people. And there's a track record of him saying so simply because he was a survivor of that siege at Saybrook Fort. This map, by the way, is sort of interesting. It shows you the rough area of what became the New Haven colony, which was eventually absorbed by the Connecticut colony. But it shows as in its heart, basically what it is Quinnipiac land from west to east and up to the north. Now, I highlight this part of the New Haven Treaty only because I want to emphasize the emphasis that the English put on the language. So if you look at it, it says that ye said sachem, his council and company, do jointly profess, affirm, and convent that ye said Mamogan is the sole sachem of Quinnipiac and hath an absolute and independent power to give, alien, dispose, or sell all or any part of the lands of the Quinnipiac. And it goes on and on and on. Okay. And then they could go on to say that, oh yeah, nobody else has a claim. Nobody else has a claim. Well, the funny thing was, guess who steps up afterwards and says, wait a minute, I got a claim. I'm Shambashu. I'm his sister. And that kind of messes things up. So they have to negotiate with her. But one of the important things that she points out that they put in the treaty is she says that, look at, we remember how horrible it was when the Pequot were dominating us and the Mohawks as well. And so we remember what it was like to flee to the English and be protected by them. So she makes sure they put in this treaty that the English, for the right to share the land, will protect the Quinnipiac from their enemies. And that's an important point. So when people ask me, why did the Quinnipiac sign this? They signed it because they were reduced in numbers and they were terrified and they saw the benefits of living next to the English in terms of trade, and they wanted their protection. Now, the English weren't done. They wrote into this treaty some really interesting things. And as you can see, the English would have free access to all fishing and hunting. Free access to all the meadows. Now, the meadows were all the land that the native people had already cleared of forest. The English would have the free ability to cut timber, including on land that was designated, as you'll see, to the Quinnipiac. And they would also have the ability to let their livestock roam unfenced. Now, this becomes an incredible problem for the Quinnipiac later on because their cows, the English cows, would walk into Native American cornfields and start munching away. The hogs would go down into the clam beds and dig up all the clams. The Native American dogs would get all fired up and go kill a hog or a cow. And then the English would have a bird about the fact that the dogs were killing their livestock. And it was a terrible situation. And every time the Quinnipiac complained, the English formed a commission. And that was it. Now, according to this, the agreement, the Quinnipiac agreed to reside on 1,200 acres on the eastern side of the harbor. We'll talk about that in a second. They would have free access to traditional lands east to the mouth of the Connecticut River. So the English said, oh yeah, you can come and go with all the land from here all the way to the Connecticut River. That's yours to go back and forth, hunt, do whatever you want to do. They can hunt freely, but they can't set traps anywhere where the English livestock roam or even harm the English livestock, which once again gets to be a problem. They can't disturb the English fishing weirs, which the Native Americans had taught them how to create these things to fish on this, to catch the fish when they're migrating up and down the streams. And this is the other fun one. They had to agree not to enter the English town on the Sabbath because these were good English Puritans. They were in church all day long on Sunday. And what the native people, because they had no sense of private property or whatever, they would kind of walk around the town, walk into people's houses, and that drove the English absolutely crazy. So they had to agree not to do that anymore. So you can see right from the beginning, you have a situation where the English have all the rights and they're beginning to restrict the Quinnipiac. But then you ask, well, why did Quinnipiac do this? Once again, they were a situation where they're suddenly a minority before a powerless group that has come, and they're trying to work out a deal where these people will protect them. Now, this is a map that was created by John Menta that shows you the early New Haven and Mayunkatuk situation. You see New Haven town over here on this side of the harbor, New Haven Harbor here, and the 1,200 acres that the English came up with that idea. Hey, we'll give you 1,200 acres, okay, on the East Shore. All right. I don't think that Quinnipiac understood what 1,200 acres meant. But anyway, this is where Mayunkatuk became, and this is where the Quinnipiac would live all the way up until about 1630, 1640. I mean, 1730, 1740. Right here is called Indian Hill. That's where Fort Worcester is today. That's where that monument is located. There's actually ruins of an American fort on Fort Worcester today. It was originally the site of a of the Quinnipiac fortified village, and then the English built a fort there during the American Revolution. There was actually a big battle fought in New Haven Harbor, where the English drove the Americans off Fort Worcester. But in the process, they saved New Haven from being burned. And then later there was a Civil War era fort. But if you go to Fort Worcester today, you can see the ruins of the fort. So, and then of course that dotted line that you see going right through the Indian reservation, which they didn't use that word back then, that's actually Townsend Avenue today in New Haven. And of course, once again, we love Ezra Stiles because as he wandered around New Haven, he drew pictures. And this is a picture where he drew where the Native American fort was on Fort Worcester Hill. And of course, he also noted things like the burial ground and stuff like that, which was completely and totally looted over the next couple hundred years. So by 1639, 30, I'd say 1640, the native population of Quinnipiacs were still located in 4 basic villages. You see Monowis up there on the Quinnipiac River. You see Mamawagan's village, Mayunkatuk, over on the east side of the New Haven Harbor. You have Indian Neck here, which is Totoket, and then you have Guilford. But Guilford, this map shows Shapashu and her village over in 1639 in what is now Madison, and we'll get to that in a second. This is one of my favorite documents. You guys live in Branford, Totoket. You gotta love Monowis. He was a wheeler dealer. What happened was this: when the New Haven people in 1638, 3 weeks later, they said, well, who owns that land over there to the west? I mean, to the east of us. Guess who really raised his hand? Monowis. And he said, oh yeah, that's my land. And I've got a deal with you. He didn't work out the deal with the Totukets here and our Quissaquanch. They're not involved in this treaty. He turned over for a very small amount of gifts, control of what is now Branford and East Haven to the English. So early on in 1638, what is now Branford became part of that New Haven colony under the control of New Haven. And Monowis wasn't done. We'll get back to him again later on because he does this again later. He sells what's now Wallingford and Meriden to 3 different groups of Englishmen. He's really something. So, but anyway, this is that, and you can see his signature there because of course the English always said you got to sign, you got to sign. Well, they don't write, so they make a symbol that would be a symbolic of him, and he's the bow and arrow there. This is the next treaty, which is really sort of interesting. This is the Monowis or Guilford Treaty. And what happened was a group of 3 ships of Englishmen came straight from England to New Haven under the leadership of Reverend Henry Whitfield. And the idea was that they were going to start their own plantation, separate plantation or colony here somewhere along the shore of what's now Connecticut. And so after landing in New Haven Harbor, they began to look around. What would be an ideal place for us to set up our community? And they landed on what's now Guilford or Monowis, mostly because the area from where it's now the harbor inland had already been cleared. It was perfect for farmland by the Native American people, the Monowis under Shapashu. And so they negotiated this treaty. And I used to make my students read this. Do you have any volunteers out there? You could do it if you tried, But basically what it is an agreement between Shapashu and the people of Monowis to turn over what is now Guilford to the English, at least according to the English. This is a larger version of what the Massachusetts Historical Society, which has the control of this treaty today, sort of allows people to see. But luckily, over at the Dudley Farm, we've been able to get actually the original of both of these, or at least copies of the original of both, which we'll have in our exhibits. But the neat thing about this is that what's down below. Down below is a map, and this map was drawn by Henry Whitfield. Now, what he did is he asked Champashua and Quesaquanch, her uncle from Totoket, to identify exactly where we were buying, okay? And what are the boundaries? And what this actually is a map that shows you the boundaries of the shoreline here from roughly where Clinton is all the way to past, well, actually all the way to what is now East Haven. And you see here, this is Long Island Sound, okay? This is Faulkner's Island. These are the Thimble Islands. Monunkatuck, the village, the native village, was actually located right here. It's located by those slash marks. What they were purchasing actually was from the Cuddalore River right here, which is the East River that divides Madison and Guilford today, all the way over to here, the Oquanock River, which is the Stony Creek, okay? And here you can see Totoket. So what Whitfield and the boys were making sure is they identified exactly what pieces of land they were purchasing. And as I show you in the printout of the treaty, they make it a big deal to make sure that the Sachem squaw is the sole possessor and that she's the one who can turn this land over to us, okay? And then thirdly, you see listed a group of gifts that the English gave the Monunkatuck or the Quinnipiac. Now, the interesting thing about this is people say they sold Guilford for 12 fathoms of wampum, 12 glasses, 12 pairs of shoes, et cetera, et cetera. No. In the native tradition, when you made an agreement with somebody and you were allowing people to share something, the group that you were giving that a right to would give you gifts. It was a native tradition. The English figured this out real early. All right. Now, of course, from the English point of view, they're not giving gifts to share. These are goods that are completing the sale. Because you can see at the very bottom, after it lists 2 English codes, it says that Champashua, or the squaw, Sachem squaw, they don't want to say her name, professes herself to be fully paid and satisfied. So there you go. Okay. So what happened as a result of this is the people under Champashua agreed to move across the East River or Cuddalore River to what is now Madison, because that was still part of their territory, okay? And that was also written up in part of the treaty, which I didn't show you. Well, Whitfield was kind of curious. He was a well-educated man. He decided to write down the names of the people who were in Monunkatuck, Guilford at the time. He only wrote down the men's names. He would not write down her name. You can see Sunk Squaw, there you go. But he wrote down the men's names and whether or not they had a wife, whether or not they had any children. But the sad thing about this, in Monunkatuck, the village of Monunkatuck had 33 people, 13 men, 8 women, 12 children, okay? And John Menta, once again, the Yale professor, had estimated that pre-pandemic or a smallpox epidemic, Monunkatuck probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 people. So you can see
by 1639, 6 years, 5 to 6 years later, their population had been absolutely decimated. And one of the ideas that gets kicked around by historians today is that the Monongahela realized we don't have a viable population here. We really can't sustain ourselves all that well. Why don't we move to a spot which is easier for us to maintain our way of life, but yet have these English people next to us? So once again, they'll protect us, and and we can also trade with them. So in this map, therefore, you see Champashua way over here, okay? This is what's now Madison, Connecticut today, okay? And once again, you have the folks here at Indian Neck still, which Monowis has sold to the English, but they're still here, which is nice. And then you have Memoigan and the other Quinnipiac here on their 1,200-acre reservation. Now, did this mean that the Quinnipiac had to live in these places all year round? The answer there is no. They were continuing to live their seasonal lifestyle. So what they would do is they would live in these villages, in particular in the spring and summer, to take advantage of resources along the shoreline and the rivers. Then they would move inland in the fall and winter to protected valleys where they would hunt and just kind of get through the winter without having to deal with life along the shoreline. As you guys know, that can be kind of nasty sometimes, right? In the winter. So there were times when these villages seemed almost vacant to the English. And of course, the English, where are they going? What are they doing? Why don't they stay here? Why aren't they farming like us? Why don't they live like us? I mean, the English were just going through all these sort of things, not realizing that these people were following a life way that had existed for thousands and thousands of years. I'm going to kind of skip that part. Here's Ezra Stiles again. I'm sorry, I can't help it. He's drawn a map of Guilford, and he shows where the Native American people once lived, and also Killingworth. Now, the interesting thing about this map is that he doesn't show something, and that is that there were a lot of Quinnipiacs that were living in what is now today North Guilford, North Madison, and Killingworth. And they were living there because they were away from, guess who? The English. And they were able to maintain their lifestyle a little easier that way. There were communities that I'll talk about later on, that in North Guilford in particular, and also in Killingworth, that lasted almost into the early 1800s. Now, here's where we get to something interesting. I don't know if you remember me mentioning Uncas when I talked about the Pequot War. Well, he had gotten into a big fight with the Pequots over who was going to be sachem of the Pequots after the Pequot sachem died. He wanted to be, but unfortunately the Pequot chose a different guy named Sassacus. So Uncas was ticked off. He said, "I'm over here." And he was exiled, and he ended up going up and living with the Connecticut River Indians around Hartford. And there he plotted against the Pequots, and he was one of the main instigators in the creation of the Pequot War. But when the war broke out, he fought on the side of the English against the Pequot. And as a result, he was rewarded by the English of Connecticut, Massachusetts, as being sort of the policeman of the surviving Native Americans in Connecticut. And of course, he loved this idea because he could dominate and control, push them around and take over land and all this sort of stuff. So what is now Madison, Connecticut, was land that was Quinnipiac land. And the Hammonasses were a sub-sachendom of the Quinnipiac. And they were also related to the Niantic, who lived in what's now Westbrook and Old Saybrook in that area. Well, Uncas just married for one of his wives, because he had multiple wives, the daughter of the Hammonasset sachem, and she had a son. And when she had a son, he claimed that land that is now Madison, which was Quinnipiac land, to be his because of his son's birth. And he told the Quinnipiac under Champashua, "You got to get out of here. This is my land. You got to leave. You got to leave." And this became a real source of competition and a problem. But what happened in the end is that Uncas in his wily sort of ways, and because he was an ally of the English, was able to manipulate the situation to the point where the English said, as long as you make a deal with the other native claimants, Quinnipiac or whoever, that it is your land, then it's yours. Okay, and he manipulated the situation. He intimidated Shapasha and the Quinnipiac. Shapasha and her group just, as finally in 1641, just picked up and left. And what they did is they merged with the people here and in New Haven. And Uncas then turned around a year later and sold. This time he's selling the land. He's not sharing. He sold the land for 4 coats, 4 English coats, a couple of other things to the English from Guilford. And his motivation was that he wanted to be on good terms with the English of Guilford because he saw that they might be helpful to him someday in the future. So that is actually the 1641 section of this map that you see here. This is what is today Madison. This is Guilford, and this is what they got from Shapasha. We'll talk about what happens here in a second. Eventually, then Uncas also has his son sell, another son, not that son, but another son sell what's now North Madison to the English as well. And then in 1686, the Quinnipiac make a deal for this, which I'll get into in a second. And this is some of the Uncas stuff. But the funny thing about, by the time the English are dealing with Uncas, they put into these clauses. This treaty or agreement is like 7 pages long. But they put it. He has to identify every single rock, stream, tree. I swear, and say, no, it's not mine. It's the English. And then he has to agree never to have any of his men or himself hunt, fish, or even cross the land again. The English wanted nothing to do with him, from the English from Guilford. So this gets us back to, guess what? Totoket. Okay. Now, while all this is going on, here in Totoket, Native people are continuing to live on Indian Neck. Okay. The population is shrinking because there's not a lot of ability to expand in terms of locating resources and things of that nature. The town of Branford is established in 1644 and is growing, but they seem to get along really, really well. One of the early ministers, Abraham Pearson, some of you may know about Abraham Pearson. He was one of the early Protestant Puritan ministers here. He tries to convert the Quinnipiac at Totoket. And turns out it wasn't very successful, but he was able to write a catechism in the Quinnipiac language, which he thought they would like, but it turned out not to be the case. This is a treaty signed in 1680. Oh, I got on my glasses. 86. Okay, I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Once again, this is about 3 pages long. What had happened is, in 1686, the English of Branford went to the Totoket on Indian Neck and said, we bought this land, notice bought this land from Monowis, but we're not too sure about all that. And Monowis is dead, and we don't really know where the borders of this are. We know that we agreed to use the land together. We know you have your little Indian Neck place here, but we would like you to define specifically what the borders are of what we now know as Branford and North Branford. And so what happened was they wrote this treaty as if the Totoket were writing it. And they wrote it in a way which says, yes, you go to this tree 1,000 yards and you go to the stream. And I mean, they did the entire borders of what is now Branford and North Branford.
in detail, based on rock piles and, Lake Saltonstall and all that sort of stuff. But they did it in a way which made it sound like the Totoket were actually writing this. But at the end, the Totoket leaders, the sachem at that point his name was Wampum. He and the other leaders agreed to it. But because what the English clearly put into this agreement or treaty was the fact that the native people could remain on their reservation on Indian Neck, that was their place, okay? And the Totoket by then realized, look, they got their farms out there. I mean, we can't do anything out there anymore anyway. And they said, okay, well, we'll agree to it. So that's how Branford actually became owned by the English. Up to that point, Branford was sort of in a no man's land, I guess, of exactly who controlled it, though we know who thought they did. And then there's this other treaty here in 1706. This is with, once again, the people of New Haven, who wanted once and for all to find out where the actual boundaries of the land that they had actually agreed to buy in 1638 with the Quinnipiac and then Monowis actually were. And they negotiated this with Champashua's daughter. You can see her signature on the very bottom right. Her name was Shambisqua. They negotiated this with her, and basically what they did is they laid out the borders of what is now New Haven County, and they were all the way up to what is now Wallingford, Meriden, and Cheshire. And the Quinnipiac said, yeah, those are the lands that we agreed to use and that you agreed to use. The difference is that the English in both Totoket and Branford and New Haven and in Guilford always allowed the Quinnipiac to come and go as they wanted, let them come, if they wanted to hunt, if they wanted to fish, they could do so. The problem was, certainly by 1706, that lifestyle that they had lived for thousands of years was impossible because the resources were gone. The English were very busy turning the entire countryside into an English countryside. That's what they wanted. Fences, plowed fields, managed forests, cutting the trees down to sell lumber. It was impossible for the Quinnipiac to continue to live their lifestyle. So many of them began to drift away. And by drift away, I mean they'd leave in small groups, they'd leave as families. The young men would leave and go. And where would they go? Well, they would go and they would join other groups that were not as stressed in terms of land. And then I'll also get into where they get involved with a migration group, first up to Farmington. So I just want to quickly go through an evolution of what the relationship was like between the English and the Quinnipiac over time. And you can see in this slide, it talks about what life was like in the 1640s, the 50s, and the 60s. And in the 1640s, it was really a system of mutual dependency. The Quinnipiac were getting what they wanted in terms of trade goods and protection. And they were also being able to sort of work within the English economy, working as providing them with meat, trapping for them, acting as guides, things of that nature. By the time you get to the 50s and 60s, that dependency is lessening because the English are incredibly well established and they're spreading out. That land that was seen as shared is now becoming English farms and villages. And so that transformation of the environment was really, really getting going and it put a lot of stress on the Quinnipiac. The result was that the Quinnipiac, especially here in Totoket and also on Indian Neck and Mayuntutuk,
they were forced to depend more and more and more on growing corn and squash and beans because their traditional other foods that they traditionally depended upon were no longer becoming available to them. And then you get into the 1670s and 1680s, and this is things where things turn really sort of sour. In 1675, the worst war ever fought in the United States, or what is now the United States, in terms of percentage of casualties to the population took place. It was called King Philip's War. And what happened is the Native American people in Massachusetts, led by a native by the name of Massasoit, King Philip to the English, he was the leader of the Wampanoag. They rose up against the people of Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay. And the reason why is they were losing their land and they couldn't negotiate anything to sort of stop it. Other Native American groups joined them. In Massachusetts in particular, the Nipmuc, for one, that were up and still are up in the Worcester area, for example. The war was horrible. There were a lot of atrocities on both sides. Many, many English towns in Massachusetts were burned. Native villages were burned as well. There were massacres. It was a really horrible, horrible war. Connecticut, for the most part, escaped this war simply because of, guess who? Uncas. Uncas was an old man, but he was able to rally the Native Americans who were still in Connecticut onto the side of the English, and even the Quinnipiac fought on the side of the English in this war. So Connecticut never really suffered to a certain extent the way Massachusetts and then later Rhode Island did. But when the war was over, the native people had been defeated under King Philip. Their population was decimated again. Many were sold into slavery in the American South, but mostly to the Caribbean. And from that point on, Native Americans were never, ever going to be a threat to the English in New England again. So by 1677, 1678, it was over in terms of Native people having any sort of influence on what was going on in what became the New England colonies. With that happening, the New Haven people turned on the Quinnipiac with suspicion. They didn't trust them. They thought they were going to join with their fellow Native Americans. And so they put into all these restrictions in terms of Quinnipiacs being able to come and go, whether or not they could even have relatives who live someplace else come visit them, and certainly not allow any strange Indians to show up. And of course, you know, the Quinnipiac complained, but they were pretty much powerless to do anything other than to complain. And along the same time, what happened is as they were falling out of the economy because they could no longer function within the English economy, they started to turn to actually selling land. So, for example, that 1,200-acre reservation in Fairhaven started to shrink as the Quinnipiac would sell parcels off to English farmers who would pay. Of course, they would. When you look at the amounts that they're getting paid, you think, oh yeah, I can't believe it. Like 10 pounds for 30 acres, you know, that kind of thing. But of course, a pound back then had more value. Then a problem happened where alcohol became a big problem for the Quinnipiac, and partly because a lot of the Quinnipiac men would work for the English and then they would get paid in alcohol when they weren't supposed to. A lot of the English traded with traded illegally alcohol with them. And what would happen is some of these guys, my favorite one is a guy by the name of Rum Tom. Actually, he signed that 1706 treaty. He would go into New Haven and raise hell, drunk as anything, and end up in jail, right? And of course, guess what the English would say? Got to pay to get them out, otherwise they're going to keep them here. Okay, so the only recourse the Quinnipiac had was to, guess what? Sell land, and that's what they did. So what happened was the same thing started happening over here in Totoket. Indian neck reservations started to shrink in size as time went on. Now, in 1686, I don't know if you guys remember that map that showed Uncas and Guilford and Madison and stuff. There was a section of what is now North Guilford that was still disputed between the Quinnipiac and the men and women, well, no, excuse me, men of Guilford, right? And so the men of Guilford decided they wanted to, quote unquote, purchase this land so that we could know exactly where the northern boundary of our town is, right? So they negotiated with Shampash's son, his name was Nausup, for the purchase of what is now North Guilford. However, Nausup made sure in this agreement that the Quinnipiac could continue to live in North Guilford, hunt and fish in North Guilford, come and go in North Guilford. And he established a community of first Quinnipiac and then later other native groups from other places on what is now West Lake in North Guilford, West Pond. And that community actually survived all the way up until the 1830s. The last recorded person living there when she passed away, because that's how they kept track of the native people when they died. It was 1839 and her name was Mary. So unlike other places, North Guilford maintained a small but stable population of Quinnipiac. And these were people who were from not just Quinnipiac people, but they were Nahantics, they were Tunxis, they were Wangunks and people like that. Okay. Hang in there, folks. I'm almost done. By the 1720s, 1770s, this whole sailing of land that was really going gung-ho, and people were just moving away to join other refugee groups. There is a group of first it was a colonial group during the colonial times, and then state group, and it's still a state group today that's recognized by the state of Connecticut, not federally, but by the state in northwestern Connecticut, called the Schaghticoke. The Schaghticoke actually were made up of groups of people from all different southern Connecticut tribes or groups. So there were Quinnipiac, there were Nahantic, there were Wangunks, there were all Pogasets, all these other groups sort of came together. The first sachem of the Schaghticoke was actually a Quinnipiac by the name of George Maui, his name was, who had been born in what was then called East Haven. Other groups, others joined the people like the Mohegan and the Pequot. Others began to just move away and kind of hide in the woods and do the best to kind of blend into the white population. And then what happened is there was this, during the Second Great Awakening in New England, it was a religious movement. Many native people began to convert to Christianity, especially under the leadership of two native ministers. One was Sansom Occam and the other one was Joseph Johnson. And what they decided to do was we're going to move away and we're going to establish ourselves in Christian Indian communities away from the English. And this happened in a couple of different groups in a couple of different times. Many of the Quinnipiac actually did leave and they joined these groups. The first group moved actually to Stockbridge, Massachusetts under the protection of some Moravian Christian ministers. And then eventually another group joined what was called the Brothertown movement, and they moved all the way up to Brothertown, what is now Brothertown, New York. And eventually by 1830, 1840, this Brothertown group actually had migrated all the way to Wisconsin, near Green Bay, where they still are today. And we know that there are people there with Quinnipiac who are Quinnipiac descendants, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to make contact with any of them as of yet. But the bulk of the Quinnipiac actually moved north to Farmington, Connecticut, and joined a group called the Tunxis. And they lived there for about 30 years until the Tunxis Quinnipiac group actually went and merged with the Brothertown people. So as of right now, as far as we know, we have not been able to locate any Quinnipiac descendants, but we're working hard on trying to do that. But the Quinnipiac name lives on. And one reason why I started doing these talks is that a friend of mine, Professor Julia Giblin from Quinnipiac University, she's in the anthropology department. She asked me one day, hey, Jim, would you come talk to my students about why the university is called Quinnipiac? So I did, and it was an interesting series of classes. And now I go every semester to do that. But, you know, most people know the name Quinnipiac, not because of the native people, but because of the university, right? And of course, they're polling and things of that nature. But incidentally, I love this picture because it shows the campus, I guess. But you know what's behind there? Sleeping Giant, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, let's get back to Indian Neck, because by 1740, guess what? They're all gone. And guess what? By the early 1800s, this was happening. It's a resort community. You have gigantic, big resorts, especially when the railroad comes through in the 1800s, where New Yorkers can come up and stay on Indian Neck in the shoreline all the way around this area. And this is a postcard of the Monowis house that was on Indian Neck. I'm not sure exactly where it was. Somebody may know. Yeah, I know who knows. Okay. There you have one survivor, you know that, right? Dale Winigo is the only survivor of that time period. So, which is right partly where the Dutch fort is. Quinnipiac became known for their basket making, and this is a great example of one that's up in with this Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington Depot. And then of course there's Sleeping Giant, and I love this picture. This is pre-Quinnipiac University, and it shows a great profile of Sleeping Giant. Now to the Quinnipiac, this is sacred land. And it's still, if there are Quinnipiac, they would still say this is sacred land. That is one of their main spiritual entities by the name of Hobomok. He was a giant, a stone giant. He was also the spiritual entity that if you did not appease him and sort of give him offerings once in a while, he'd make terrible things happen. But as soon as you sort of appeased him, the terrible things would stop. So he was sort of like a Kokopelli type of creature for the Quinnipiac. His twin brother, Stone Giant, is Mashop, and Mashop is West Rock today. And your Thimble Islands exist because legend has it that the Quinnipiac got into a big fight with Mashop, and they drove him away, and he ran across to Long Island, and he was so mad at the Quinnipiac that he started picking up rocks and throwing them across Long Island Sound at the Quinnipiac here, and that's how you ended up with the Thimble Islands, according to the Quinnipiac. The Quinnipiac may be gone, but there's still signs of them here and there. This is actually this Thanksgiving rock. Now, this was originally what was called a rocking rock, and it's a big boulder in Fairhaven that the native people would rock back and forth. And as it rocked, it would hit the base rock and make a thundering sound. And that was to call the spirits, right? Well, every Thanksgiving up until about 1850, the Quinnipiac would come from all over and celebrate the harvest festival around this rock. Until two Quinnipiac got drunk, got in an argument, one killed the other one, and the owner of the property said, forget it, you can't come anymore. It's now on private property. It's on a little section of a 1/4 acre lot with a house on it. It was all overgrown with weeds and brambles and things like that. Nobody really knew where it was until 2003, when people decided to look for it. And the homeowners since then allowed them to clear all the way around it, and people raised money to put up this little plaque in memory of the Quinnipiac there. And on that little offering there was done by a friend of mine who was so moved by it. She went down there one day and like put the goldenrod and clamshells and things like that, and to honor them. So this is not too far away from that Fort Worcester Park where that original monument is. Okay, so why am I here? Well, here we go. Gordon Brainerd. Some of you may have known Gordon. He was a Stony Creeker. His name was actually his nickname was Ike. He was a lifelong collector of Quinnipiac items going back to his childhood. And in 2003, he would collect things, by the way, from West Haven all the way over to Clinton, up to Cheshire, but primarily this area, Branford, Guilford, Clinton, Madison. In 2003, he approached us because he was one of the early members of the Dudley Farm and said, I'd like that place to put my collection. Can I put it here? We had no place really, but we had just raised the Munger Barn. It's an event facility that we have there. And in the loft, we said, Gordon, you can put your collection there. And he did. And it's been there ever since. And it's there, still there exactly, well, almost exactly the way he had left it. He passed away in early 2021. Gordon was passionate about preserving the history and legacy of the Quinnipiac. And one of the things we assured him was that we would do that. So right now, as we're in this room, we just put the roof on a brand new building that will house a brand new museum. It's called the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum. We have two wonderful expert design exhibit people from Yale Peabody Museum that I'm not going to point to them, but they're in the back row way by that post. And we've got a wonderful Native American advisor and a group of dedicated people, of which a few of them are here in the audience today. It's going to be a unique, really special museum that'll tell the story of the Quinnipiac from the Ice Age up until what we call the diaspora, when they all sort of dispersed. And we all owe to good old Gordon. And that's the barn that it's currently in. It's up on that top floor above the door. So that's it. And most people also say, no, there are no Indians left in Connecticut. And of course, we all know there certainly are. You know, everyone knows the Mohegan and the Manchatucket Pequots because of their casinos. But there's also the Eastern Pequots who live 5 miles to the east of Manchatucket. There's the Golden Hill Pawcasets who have a 1/4 acre reservation in Trumbull. That they almost lost their 1/4 acre reservation in the 1960s because they had it since colonial times, and there was didn't have a deed, they didn't have title to it. So this developer said, I'm going to build a house there. You don't have a deed on it, and he actually put a foundation in. The Pawcaset took him to court, and the courts stopped the developer, but the condition was that somebody from the Pawcaset Nation had to live on the site 24 hours a day. And so they built a house on top of the foundation, and somebody lives there. You're not the same person all the time, but somebody's always there. And then the state felt so bad about it, they gave them 108 acres of land in Colchester, Connecticut. So they also have that as part of their reservation. And then, of course, there's the Schaghticoke up in northwestern Connecticut and Kent, who've been up there now since these other groups sort of came together and formed it. But that's it. I'm done talking. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, thank you very much for listening.